The sun cast a warm golden light on the courtyard, playing on the leaves of the old oak tree, under which a large tablecloth was spread. The smell of roasting meat was in the air, mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass. There was laughter everywhere. Children were running around the yard with balloons, playing catch-up. Adults were chatting, clinking glasses of lemonade, and it seemed that this day could not be marred by anything. Jamal, a 16-year-old in a wheelchair, sat at the edge of the table with a plate full of food. He listened attentively to his uncle telling another story from his youth and occasionally inserted his own witty jokes, eliciting laughter. Although Jamal was confined to a wheelchair after a tragic accident a few years ago, his smile could light up the entire yard. He didn't let his disability define his life. Jamal knew how to be the life of the party, even in a wheelchair, and on this day he enjoyed every moment. His younger sister, Aaliyah, tried to snatch a piece of meat off his plate, and he deftly dismissed her, laughing. "Aaliyah, is your own table empty? Or do you think I'm in a wheelchair and have no eyes?" Everyone laughed. It was their world, warm, cozy, full of love. But this peace suddenly began to break down. The rumbling sound of heavy footsteps broke the harmony. A tall man in uniform appeared on the terrace. Sergeant Burke. His gaze was cold, as if he thought he owned the place. Some of the guests froze, some pretended not to notice his presence, but everyone felt the atmosphere change instantly. "Is this really a celebration?" Burke said in a husky voice, looking around at the crowd. "You're all lucky, I see. Some of you have time for fun." He glanced around the crowd, his eyes lingering on Jamala. Jamal felt that gaze, heavy, cold, like a lead bullet. He didn't know what was wrong with the man, but something told him he'd come here for a reason. Burke froze in front of Jamal, leaning a little closer than he needed to. "Wow," he stretched out with a fake smile. "What a fighter." Even in the wheelchair, he found a place at the table. Like a lightning bolt ripping through a clear sky, his words made everyone wary. The laughter died down, and people began to look at each other. But Jamal, remaining calm, replied, "What's the big deal? I have the same appetite as you, maybe even better." Burke squinted, as if he hadn't expected an answer. His smile turned into a thin line. "You're feisty, aren't you?" "That's what I respect," he said, but there was clearly a sneer in his voice. Jamal's uncle stepped forward, as if about to intervene, but Jamal raised his hand slightly, as if to say, "Don't." He realized that this was only the beginning. The tension in the air was already beginning to clench this recently perfect day into a tight fist, ready to collapse. Sergeant Burke strode across the courtyard as if it were his own private parade. He surveyed the guests at a leisurely pace, stopping occasionally to drop a careless comment. His voice was polite, but each word cut the air like a knife blade. "You're all so happy," he said as he approached the table, relaxing, having fun, as if each of you had earned a place in life. "Except, not all of you, right?" He stopped in front of Jamal. A smile played on his face, but there was a cold, calculating hatred in his eyes. "You did good, kid," he said, putting his hand on the back of Jamal's wheelchair, a little harder than necessary. "Found a way to fit in, even in this condition. It's downright inspiring." Jamal looked up at him, remaining calm. He saw his mother, sitting nearby, tense up. She wanted to intervene, but something in her son's eyes held her back. Jamal realized he couldn't show weakness. "Thank you for the compliment," he said in a flat tone. "But, my life is not something to be applauded. I just live it, just like everyone else." "Like everyone else," Burke repeated, nodding, but you could hear the sneer in his voice. "Well, it's not quite like that, is it? Still, you know." He paused, as if waiting for someone to laugh or encourage him, but there was dead silence in the courtyard. "What do you mean, sir?" Jamal asked, looking at him intently. "It's nothing serious," the sergeant said, taking a step back. "I was just thinking how hard it must be to be, you. First there was the wheelchair, then another. Well, you know." "No, sir, I don't know. Why don't you explain?" His voice sounded calm, but inside, Jamal felt a lump of anger growing in his chest. Burke laughed a fake laugh, looking around at the other guests as if looking for support. "Come on, man, relax. It's a joke. It's just, you guys know how to get attention. First, you pity your wheelchair, then you play on the fact that, you're all, oppressed and stuff, and we have to tiptoe around you so we don't hurt you. It's convenient, isn't it?" The silence around them was becoming suffocating. The guests did not know what to do. Some of them lowered their eyes, some pretended to go away to get a new portion of food, so as not to be a witness to what was happening. "You're wrong," Jamal said, his voice calm, but there was steel in it. "I'm not asking for your pity, and I'm certainly not going to make excuses for who I am." Burke smirked again, but now his smile was predatory. "Oh, you're quite the orator. You must be used to public speaking. People like you like to attract attention. But you know what's interesting? None of this is going to make you equal. Not this wheelchair, not your big words. You'll always be, inferior." He said it so calmly that each word was like a fist punch. Some of the guests wanted to say something, but Jamal raised his hand, stopping them. His gaze was fixed on the sergeant. "The only thing that makes me inferior is that I'm currently sitting and you are standing. But trust me, that's easily remedied if you keep going." Fury flashed in the sergeant's eyes, but he quickly hid it behind another fake smile. "Are you threatening me, boy?" he asked, leaning a little lower. "No, sir," Jamal replied. "I'm just saying that if you don't know how to respect others, you can be taught to do so." Burke hummed, looking back at the silent crowd again. "Did you hear that? This guy thinks he can teach me. It's funny, isn't it?" But no one laughed. The atmosphere was like a taut string, ready to burst at any moment. People looked at each other, seeing that the situation was getting out of control. "Maybe you have something to say?" Burke asked one of the men at the table, but he just shrugged and looked away. The sergeant snorted and turned to Jamal again. "Well, boy, let's see how long you can be so brave, 'cause I can play this game a lot longer than you can." And with those words, he walked away, leaving behind the icy cold and the heavy feeling that it was only the first blow. Jamal stared after him, feeling the tension constrict the air around him. He knew this day would never be the same again. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you have encountered something similar in your life. We value your opinion, and we'd love to hear your stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. Sergeant Burke stood back, leaning against the railing of the terrace, as if trying to decide on his next move. His gaze returned again and again to Jamal, who, despite the tension, remained calmly engaged with his family. But inside, Burke was seething. He was used to seeing people as fearful and submissive, and this boy, in a wheelchair, and a black man at that, dared to act like he was equal to everyone around him. No, even superior. "Hey, boy," came his loud voice. The conversation at the table died down. Everyone looked at Burke again. He walked slowly toward Jamal, pretending to smile. But there was nothing but contempt in his eyes. "You said you could teach me something, didn't you?" Burke stopped next to the wheelchair, looming over Jamal. "That's interesting. You must have a lot of experience, especially in how to crawl through life." Jamal raised his head, meeting his gaze. There wasn't an ounce of fear in his eyes. "You know, sir," he said quietly, "you seem too focused on looking down, perhaps because you're afraid to look up." The family froze. Even the air around them seemed to stop. Burke grinned, but his face hardened. "You like to joke around, huh?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Do you think it makes you smart? Or maybe you want everyone to feel sorry for you?" "I'm not asking for pity," Jamal replied firmly. "That's something you'll probably never understand. I don't live my life to be pitied." Burke leaned closer, almost touching Jamal's face. "Maybe you should rethink that. You're in a wheelchair, boy. You've already lost in this life. And if you think your speeches are going to make a difference, you're sorely mistaken. People like you will always be down. And people like you will always prove it," Jamal parried, "because they're afraid they'll lose their false power." It was a low blow, and Burke felt it. His face contorted with anger, but he immediately pulled back his mask of politeness. "Look, let's not turn this into a scene," Jamala's aunt intervened, trying to lighten the mood. "We're just having a vacation. No one wants to fight." But Burke couldn't stop now. His anger was growing by the minute. He turned to the woman, giving her an icy glare. "Oh, I'm not fighting," he said with a fake smile. "I'm just trying to explain to your nephew that the world isn't what he thinks it is." He turned to Jamal again. "You know what the funny thing is?" His voice got quieter, almost intimate. "People like you, always thinking that someone is oppressing them, that they deserve more. But the truth is, you chose this life for yourself. Yeah, fate put a foot in your mouth, but you didn't do anything about it, did you?" Jamal clenched his fists but held himself in check. "You talk as if you know my life," he replied, "but you don't know anything about me. And if you think your uniform gives you the right to say such things, you are mistaken." Burke froze. His face went pale for a moment, but then he smiled again. "I'll tell you what I know." His voice was almost a whisper. "You'll never get out of that wheelchair. You'll never be like the others. And the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." The sergeant's words hung in the air like choking smoke. Jamal's family could no longer remain silent. "This is too much," Jamal's father said, rising from his seat. "You have no right to talk to him like that." "Right?" Burke smirked. "I'm here as a guest, and I'm just giving my opinion. Is that a crime? When your opinion is aimed at humiliation, it's not an opinion. It's an insult," Jamal's mother replied sharply, standing up next to her husband. Jamal looked at the sergeant, and there were no tears or fear in his eyes, only hardness and dignity. "You can say what you want," he said, "but know one thing. If you are trying to prove your superiority, you have already lost inside." Those words were the last straw. The sergeant took a step back, his face contorted with anger. "Well," he hissed, "let's see how far your courage goes." He turned and walked away, leaving an icy chill in his wake. Jamal's family gathered around him, supportive and encouraging. But everyone knew this was only the beginning. The storm was yet to come. The silence that hung over the courtyard was almost palpable. no more conversation resumed, and everyone tried to avoid the gaze of Sergeant Burke, who stood a little apart, watching them all intently. But his attention, like a sharp spotlight, returned inexorably to Jamal. Something about the teenager irritated him to the core. His confidence, his restraint, his ability to hold his head high despite his wheelchair. "All right," Burke said at last, his voice cutting through the tense air like thunder. "Come on, let's all get together. I got an idea." The guests glanced around, but began to tentatively pull toward the center of the courtyard. Burke was clearly up to something, and that something felt like an impending storm. Jamal stayed where he was, watching the sergeant with the same quiet insistence that had pissed him off before. "You know," Burke began, pacing back and forth in front of the guests, "I've always loved stories of true fortitude, about people who, despite their circumstances, they don't give up, like our boy here." He turned sharply to Jamal, pointing a finger at him as if he were a museum piece. "So, kid, you gonna show everyone how strong you are?" "I'm not sure I know what you mean," Jamal replied, his voice still calm, but he could feel the tension building in his chest. "Let me explain," Burke continued, stepping closer. He stopped behind Jamal, putting a heavy hand on the back of the wheelchair. "You want everyone to respect you, right? Then show them you're capable of something." He pushed the stroller forward, causing Jamal to roll a few steps. The guests gasped, but Burke only laughed. "You see it? It's moving. I thought it was just a chair with wheels, but it works." "Stop it," Jamal's mother shouted, stepping forward, but Burke held up a hand to stop her. "Come on, it's just a joke," he said, turning to her. "Or do you think he can't handle a little challenge?" Jamal leveled the wheelchair, his hands gripping the rims of the wheels tightly. He could feel the anger coming in waves, but he didn't let it come out. Instead, he raised his head and said, "If you want to show your strength, sir, you've chosen the wrong way. Attacking someone who can't stand up is not strength." Jamal's words were like a slap in the face. Burke froze for a moment, but then his face contorted into a grin again. "Who says you can't get up?" he said slowly, his voice soaked with venom. "Come on, give it a try. Prove to everyone that you can." Jamal answered nothing. He only looked at the sergeant, and there was a power in his eyes that Burke couldn't understand. It pissed him off. "What, did you swallow your tongue?" Burke kept pushing. "Or are you afraid that if you stand up, you'll fall? Although, that's probably your life in general, right? Always falling." "Enough," Jamal's father shouted, stepping forward. "You've gone too far." "Me?" Burke acted surprised. "This is my fault? I'm just trying to help your son understand where he belongs." "My place is where I choose to be," Jamal said calmly. "And certainly not under your shadow." "Big words," Burke said with a chuckle. "But that's all you got. Words. Because without them, you're nothing. You're just a pathetic little boy in a wheelchair who thinks he can be an equal." Burke's words were like whiplashes, and each one made Jamal's heart clench. But he showed no pain. He wouldn't let himself break in front of this man. "You are mistaken, sir," Jamal replied, looking straight into Burke's eyes. "I am more than you can imagine, because I have something you will never have: respect, for myself and for others." It was as if those words had set the stage. For a moment, even Burke could not find anything to say. He clenched his fists and anger flashed in his eyes. But he had no time to do anything, for one of the guests said decisively, "Hey, that's enough. This is a family party, not a place for you to play games." Burke turned around, his gaze darting between the guests. He could see that he was losing control of the situation, but his rage was boiling inside him, and he knew he wouldn't leave until he put that boy in his place. And the tension around them grew like a thunderstorm ready to break. The courtyard froze. The guests stood as if petrified, some trying to avoid Sergeant Burke's gaze, others desperately seeking support in the eyes of others. The atmosphere was heavy, like a taut rope ready to break. Jamal's family huddled closer to the teenager, as if trying to protect him from an invisible but very real blow. Jamal's mother looked at her son, who kept his composure despite the humiliation. Her heart was breaking with pain and anger. She wanted to intervene but knew it would only make things worse. This man, the sergeant, could cause harm with more than just words. His status, his cold confidence, his sense of authority made him dangerous. "We can't leave it like this," she whispered, turning to her husband. Jamal's father clenched his fists. His face was tense, and his eyes burned with the anger he was trying hard to contain. "If we interfere, he'll only get worse," he whispered back. "People like that. They like to provoke. He's looking for an excuse to break us." "He's already doing it," Aunt Jamala interjected. "Look at him. He's enjoying it." They all turned to Burke. The sergeant stood a little farther away, arms crossed over his chest, staring intently at Jamal. His grin was almost cheerful, like a man winning at his own twisted game. "So, are you two conferring?" he finally asked loudly, cutting off their whispers. "Planning how to put me in my place? Good luck. I'll wait." Jamal's mother stepped forward. "Look, we just want to have a quiet day. We didn't ask you to come here and, Burke raised his hand, stopping her. "Calmly?" he interrupted, mockingly. "Is that what you call calm when that boy in the wheelchair openly disrespects me?" Jamal raised his head. "Respect must be earned, sir," he said firmly. The words were like a blow to the face. The guests gasped, and Jamal's mother reached for her son as if to shield him from danger, but it was too late. "Deserve it." Burke stepped closer, his voice quieter, but that made it sound even more threatening. "You're telling me I have to earn respect from someone like you?" He pointed a finger at Jamal as if he were pointing a weapon at him. "You're a boy confined to a wheelchair. Do you have to tell me how to live my life? You can't even get up to look me in the eye." "That's enough," Jamal's father shouted, stepping forward. "We will not tolerate this anymore." "What are you going to do?" Burke grinned. "Call the police?" He laughed, but there was an icy tinge to his laughter. "Guess who'll be on my side?" The family froze. His words were like a stabbing blow. They all knew he was right. Sergeant Burke was part of a system that protected people like him. Even if they called the police, who would believe an ordinary family, much less a black teenager in a wheelchair, against a man in uniform? "We can't just stand by and watch," Aunt Jamala whispered, her voice trembling. "And what do you suggest?" Father replied sharply. "It could end badly for all of us." "This is bad enough," Jamal said quietly. Everyone turned to him. He met everyone's gaze. His face was calm, but there was deep pain in his eyes. "He thinks I'm weak because I'm in a wheelchair," he continued. "But he's wrong. Weakness is what he is showing now. Weakness is his fear that someone might be stronger than him." Jamal's mother put her hand on his shoulder, her eyes full of tears. "We have to do something," she said in a shaky voice. "We can't leave it like this." "No," Jamal said firmly. "I can handle it." "Jamal, no," his father whispered, but the teen had already turned to the sergeant. "If you think you can break me with your words, you're wrong. he said loudly so that everyone could hear. I'm in a wheelchair, yes, but I'm not afraid of you, because I know who I am. But you, sir, don't seem to know that. For a moment, the courtyard fell into absolute silence. The guests froze. Jamal's family stood in confusion, and Burke slowly approached the stroller. You'll regret this, boy, he hissed. His voice was almost a whisper, but there was a threat in it that sent shivers down my spine. Burke stepped back, but it was clear he wasn't done. The tension had become almost unbearable. The family felt trapped. Their fear was mixed with rage, but they couldn't find a way out. They knew the storm was just beginning. The sun was already beginning to set, casting a purple glow over the courtyard. But no one noticed the beauty of the evening. The tension in the air had become almost unbearable. The guests looked at Sergeant Burke and Jamal, as if waiting to see which one of them would make the next move. The sergeant stood directly across from the teenager, anger glowing in his eyes. He was no longer trying to hide his contempt. This was an open, blatant attack. "Come on, little fighter," Burke said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Come on, surprise us. Give another one of your clever speeches. Prove to everyone that you're not just some kid who thinks his wheelchair gives him the right to be special." Those words were like a gunshot. The guests held their breath, and Jamal's mother's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward to stop the nightmare, but Jamal raised his hand as if to say, "No need." He turned the baby carriage so that he could see all the guests, and then raised his head, looking directly at the sergeant. His voice was calm, but there was a power in it that made everyone around him freeze. "You want me to prove something? All right, I'll say it." He inhaled deeply, and at that moment the silence around him became almost ringing. "I was born in this body, in this skin color. I didn't choose who I was. But you know what I've learned over the years? People who try to break others do it because they are already broken." His words cut the air like a knife. Burke squinted, his jaw tense, but Jamal continued. "You think you're stronger than me because you can walk? Because you have a uniform, a badge, power? But power is not something you can take away from others. Power is what's inside, and I know that there is nothing inside of you but fear." Burke took a sharp step forward, but Jamal didn't back down. He looked at the sergeant, his eyes glistening with restrained tears, but his voice remained firm. "You are afraid that someone you think is weak will be stronger than you. You are afraid that someone in a wheelchair will have a better life than you. Your fear makes you violent because you don't know how else to prove to yourself that you are worth something." Jamal's words seemed to open up something in those present. Some lowered their eyes, some clenched their fists, and Jamal's mother covered her mouth with her hand to hold back her sobs. But the sergeant stepped closer, leaning in so that their faces were almost on the same level. "You don't understand anything, boy," he hissed, his voice like ice. "You live in a world that pities you, one that gives you more than you deserve because you're in a goddamn wheelchair. People like you think the whole world should turn around on them." "No one gives me anything," Jamal replied calmly. "Everything I have, I've earned. You don't know me, but you've already decided who I am. Because it's easier, because then you don't have to look at me as a person." Burke grinned, but there was anger blazing in his eyes. "A man?" he repeated. "Do you think I should see you as an equal? Never. You're nothing, just a kid who thinks he's a hero." Burke's words were like a slap in the face, but Jamal didn't flinch. "I may mean nothing to you," he said, "but to my family, to my friends, To those who know me, I mean far more than you've ever meant to anyone." Those words were the last straw. Burke straightened, his hands clenched into fists. The look he threw at Jamal was so cold and angry that it took the breath away from many of the guests. "You think you won because you can talk pretty?" he hissed. "All right, let's see how far this takes you." He abruptly grabbed Jamal's wheelchair by the handles and pushed it forward, causing the teenager to roll a few feet, nearly falling out of it. The guests gasped and Jamal's mother screamed, but Burke smirked again. "This is what your power looks like," he said. "You can't even protect yourself, and you certainly can't protect the people who care about you." Jamal, though barely able to stay in his wheelchair, slowly straightened up. There was something in his eyes that made even the most indifferent guests feel pain. "Strength isn't about attacking the weak," he said, his voice shaking, but it wasn't weakness, it was rage. "It's about staying human, even when you do everything you can to break me." But Burke wasn't listening anymore. He stared at the teenager like a predator ready to make its last stand, and Jamal's family finally decided they couldn't wait any longer. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you've had something similar happen in your life. It's important for us to hear your thoughts and stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. The sun had finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving the courtyard at the mercy of the dim light of the street lamps. The warm atmosphere of the family party had been destroyed like a piece of paper thrown into the fire. The place now breathed tension, fear, and suppressed anger. Everyone looked at Sergeant Burke, who seemed to be enjoying his power, and at Jamal, still standing proudly, despite the fact that his wheelchair had just been forcibly moved. Burke took another step forward, clenching his fists. His eyes burned with an anger that read not only hatred, but a deep-seated desire to completely subjugate the man he saw beneath him. It seemed to him that the teenager in the wheelchair was challenging him, which he simply could not leave unanswered. He was used to breaking people down, to seeing their confidence crumble before his aggression. But Jamal wouldn't give in, and it drove Burke crazy. "Do you still think you're stronger than me?" He spoke to Jamal, his voice low and threatening. "Your words are worthless. You're nothing. You're just a pathetic little boy who expects people to feel sorry for him because of that damn wheelchair." Jamal slowly raised his head and met the sergeant's gaze. He was frightened, but he didn't show it. There was pain in his eyes, but also a determination that only fueled Burke's hatred more. "Who are you to decide what I can or can't do?" Jamal said, his voice trembling but still strong. "A man who proves his power by attacking a teenager? You're only strong because someone is weaker. That's not strength. That's fear." Those words were like a punch in the face. Burke no longer tried to hide his indignation. He grabbed the back of Jamal's stroller, and everyone around him gasped. The family tried to intervene, but the sergeant raised his hand as if to warn them that he would follow through. "Listen to me, boy," he said, his voice icy. "I'll show you what it means to be at the bottom. You think you're worth anything? Let's see how far your pride goes." And before anyone could stop him, Burke swung the wheelchair over. Jamal flew out of the wheelchair, hitting the ground. The sound of the impact, deafening and painful, caused everyone around him to freeze. Jamal's mother cried out, rushing toward her son, but Burke blocked her path. "No one dares challenge me," he said, looking at Jamal, who tried to rise, leaning on his hands. His face was stained with earth, but he would not give up. His breathing was heavy, and pain coursed through his body, but he looked at Burke with the same determination he had before. "You've shown who you are," Jamal said, his voice weak, but each phrase sounded like a blow. "A strong man doesn't attack someone who can't stand up. You fear me because I don't give up, and that is your real weakness." Jamal's words were the last straw for the family. Jamal's mother, her face wet with tears, stepped forward sharply and pushed the sergeant aside. "You've crossed the line," she shouted, her voice full of anger and pain. "You want to prove your power by breaking my son? Do you think we will stand by and watch this? Do you think we are afraid of you?" Jamal's father also stepped closer, his face a mixture of anger and restrained rage. He clenched his fists, but he was still trying to keep himself from making a move that could have been fatal. "Get out of here," he said, his voice cold but threatening. "Now." Burke looked around. He noticed people beginning to rise from their seats, surrounding him. The eyes of the guests were no longer frightened. They were filled with judgment. Even those who had previously tried to avoid conflict were now looking at him with obvious contempt. He felt himself losing control of the situation. "You're all weaklings," he hissed, glaring at Jamal, who was lying on the ground. "You protect him because he's useless. You're all as worthless as he is." But no one else listened to him. Jamal's mother helped her son up, his face contorted with pain, but he did not cry. He looked at the sergeant, and there was no fear in his gaze, only pity. "You'll never know what real power is," he said, his voice weak, but everyone could hear the truth in it, "because you've never had it." Those words, spoken by a teenager lying on the ground, broken but not defeated, made Burke freeze. But even then, he did not admit defeat. He looked around at everyone, straightened up and, jaw clenched, turned around to leave. But Jamal's family knew this wasn't over. The anxiety that had been in the air was replaced by rage. At that moment, everyone realized that Sergeant Burke had crossed a line beyond which there would be no forgiveness. The courtyard was silent, but it was no ordinary silence. It breathed anger, pain, and bitterness. The guests stood in a circle, not taking their eyes off Sergeant Burke, who retreated slowly to the edge of the terrace, as if he still expected to emerge victorious from the situation. But the looks that met his eyes were no longer the looks of a frightened crowd. They were people who had seen everything, people who could no longer remain silent. Jamal was still lying on the ground, his hands shaking, but he wouldn't let himself break. His mother was kneeling beside him, cradling him as if trying to shut him out of the world. His father stood beside him, his face expressing icy determination. The sergeant had crossed the line, and it was evident in the looks on the family's faces. This was no longer just humiliation. It was the last straw. "Do you think you can just walk away after this?" Jamal's father said, his voice low but threatening. Burke turned around, trying to keep his composure. "I didn't do anything wrong," he grinned, spreading his hands. "You all made a big deal out of it. If you can't handle simple words, that's not my problem." "Simple words," Aunt Jamala said sharply, her voice ringing with rage. "You knocked a boy in a wheelchair to the ground, humiliated him in front of everyone, and now you want to pretend that nothing happened." "Leave it alone." Burke raised his hand as if trying to shut her up. "Do you realize who you're talking to?" "I'm a sergeant." "Yeah? You're nothing." Jamala's mother interrupted him, her voice shaking, but she didn't look away. "No form of yours will save you from what you've just done." Burke tensed. His habit of feeling power over people was cracking. He tried to take a step forward, but suddenly one of the guests blocked his way. It was Jamal's uncle, a tall, stout man who had been silent before, but now his face expressed everything he was thinking. "You're a stranger here," he said in a hoarse voice, "and you've gone too far." "Get him out of my way," Burke hissed, trying to keep his composure. "Or what?" Uncle asked, his voice threateningly calm. Burke was silent, realizing that for the first time he was in an environment where no one was afraid of him. The men began to move closer, encircling him in a tight ring. Their faces expressed more than anger. It was determination to end this nightmare. "You want me to apologize?" Burke finally said, his voice filled with venom. "All right. I apologize if anyone thought I did anything wrong. Is that okay with you?" "You haven't apologized," Jamal's father said firmly, stepping forward. "You don't even realize what you've done. You think you can humiliate others because you're in uniform? You think you can get away with it?" "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" Burke exploded, his voice overpowering all sound. "You're a pathetic mob, and you're a nobody," Jamal interrupted him. Those words, spoken in the teenager's weak but confident voice, hit Burke harder than any screams. He turned to Jamal, who had slowly raised himself on his hands, leaning on his mother's shoulder. His face was dirty, his clothes torn, but there was a fire burning in his eyes that could not be extinguished. "You're a nobody," Jamal repeated, "because a strong man would not humiliate another man to prove his power. A strong man knows when he's wrong." Burke wanted to answer, but his words stuck in his throat. Now everyone around him was looking at him with judgment, and even his own face seemed confused. He was used to being feared, but now no one was afraid. "You're not leaving here without consequences," Jamal's father said, his voice firm. "We'll call the police. We'll tell them what you've done, and this time no one will be silent." "Yes, of course," Burke grinned, but there was anxiety in his voice. "Like anyone would believe you. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "Yes," Jamal's mother said, her voice soaked with hatred. "With a coward." Those words were the final blow. Burke tried to maintain some semblance of control, but he had already lost. People around him started filming on their phones, and the sergeant realized he had no turning back now. He took a step back, then another, trying to leave, but the people wouldn't budge. They made him realize that his time here was over, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that his power was gone. When he left, his footsteps sounded muffled, and in that silence was the meaning of what had happened. Jamal's family stared after him, and there was anger in their eyes, but also relief. They knew this wasn't over, but it was the first step toward justice. The night at that family barbecue was just the beginning. For Jamal's family, it was one of the most painful days they had ever experienced. But despite the pain, fear, and humiliation, they knew that letting Sergeant Burke get away with it would be worse than his attack itself. This was not only a fight for justice for Jamal, it was a fight for everyone who had been subjected to similar humiliation, but kept silent because of fear. The next day, Jamal's mother sat at his bedside, holding his hand. Jamal lay quietly breathing, his body still aching from the fall, but his spirit remained undimmed. His wheelchair stood in the corner of the room as a reminder that he could still move forward, no matter what. "We will not be silent," the mother said, her voice trembling but firm. "We will make him answer for everything." Jamal looked at her, his eyes glittering. He nodded. He knew it would be hard, but he couldn't let this man break them. The family immediately sprang into action. The first thing Jamal's father did was contact a lawyer, explaining what had happened. The family then sent videos taken by guests at the barbecue to local news outlets. The footage of Sergeant Burke humiliating Jamal and tipping over his wheelchair shocked everyone who saw it. The videos instantly went viral on social media, causing a wave of anger and outrage. People left comments expressing support for Jamal and condemnation of the sergeant. But the family didn't stop there. They decided to dig deeper into Burke's past. With the help of friends and acquaintances who worked in law enforcement agencies, they began to gather information. It turned out that the attack on Jamal was not the first manifestation of his aggression. Facts that should have remained hidden were revealed. Sergeant Burke has been involved in a number of racist incidents in his service. He repeatedly used his position to oppress black citizens, insult them, threaten them, and even use force without due cause. Several complaints against him disappeared without a trace as he covered himself with his uniform and connections. But now, after attacking a teenager in a wheelchair, all these stories have started surfacing one after another. Every detail was a nail in the lid of his career. One of his former colleagues anonymously revealed that Burke openly mocked minorities and claimed that the real power lay in making people afraid. This information became public, and it was enough to start a real firestorm. Sergeant Burke's days were numbered. The leadership of his station, pressured by public opinion, immediately suspended him from service. Journalists besieged his house, trying to get comments, but the door always remained closed. On social media, people demanded justice for Jamal, creating hashtags that went to the top. Justice for Jamal became a symbol of the fight against racism and abuse of power. But for Burke, that was only the first blow. Investigators launched a formal inquiry into his actions, and soon his other crimes surfaced. One of his former bosses, who had long known about his behavior but covered for him, was forced to resign. People he had once humiliated and intimidated began to speak out. One of the loudest stories was the testimony of a woman whose family he had destroyed by trumping up accusations. Now, her words were louder than ever. It was a difficult time for Jamal's family. They knew justice was a long and painful process, but they stuck together. Every time one of them began to doubt, they looked to Jamal. He was their strength, their reminder of why they had started this fight. Even lying in bed, he was the epitome of resilience. When news of Burke's exposure reached the national level, an avalanche of repercussions descended on him. His colleagues refused to stand up for him. His name became a symbol of shame, and his family abandoned him, unable to withstand the pressure. He was left alone, stripped of everything he once had. Those who had once feared him now spoke openly, and his face became associated not with strength but with shame. But for Jamal, it wasn't about revenge. He didn't want Burke to just go down. He wanted the world to realize that abuse of power and hate have consequences. He wanted other teens in wheelchairs, other black kids who felt broken, to know they were not alone. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, Jamal's mother put her arm around his shoulders. "You're stronger than any of us," she said. "We are proud of you." Jamal smiled, his face still weakened with pain, but there was a gleam of light in his eyes. "It's not my power," he replied. "It's ours. We did it together." Though the journey was long, the family knew they had made the right choice. Now the whole world knew the truth, and justice was finally beginning to be served. In the weeks that followed that tragic evening, Jamal's family went through a storm of emotions, from anger to exhaustion, from pain to triumph. But, despite the hard journey, they never lost their unity. This unity became their shield against the injustice and cruelty that fell upon them. And though their strength sometimes deserted them, they clung to one single truth: evil will not go unpunished. Jamal was at home, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the street. He looked calm, but inside a hurricane was raging. His body was still sore from the fall. The bruises on his arms and legs were slowly coming off, but, most importantly, the mark of the humiliation he had endured remained in his soul. He knew he had to move on, but every time he closed his eyes, Sergeant Burke's figure stood before him, his predatory smile and words that were like knives cutting him from the inside out. "Are you all right, son?" his mother asked, cautiously approaching him from behind. "Yes, Mom," he answered quietly, not taking his eyes off the street. "Just thinking." She knelt down beside him, taking his hand. Her eyes were filled with pain, but also with determination. "I know how hard this is for you," she said, "but you're stronger than you think. You've proven that, not just to us, but to the world." Jamal turned his head slowly, looking at her. "Sometimes I feel like it's not enough," he admitted. "It's like, despite everything we've done, nothing will change. People like him will still think they're stronger." "But it's not true," his father said as he entered the room. "You made the world see the truth, and even if it's only the first step, it's an important one. You changed not only your life, but the lives of everyone who saw you hold on." These words touched something in Jamal's soul. He remembered the comments and messages that had come in the last few days. People from all over the world had written to him, telling their stories, sharing their pain. Some said he had inspired them to fight for their rights. Others shared how his resilience helped them believe in themselves. And then he realized that his pain had not been in vain. Meanwhile, news of Sergeant Burke continued to fill the airwaves. His face was on the front pages of the newspapers, and every mention of him was accompanied by words of shame and downfall. The investigation against him moved quickly, and it was soon learned that he would be charged with abuse of power, racist acts, and assaulting Jamal. It was not only the end of his career, but also the end of his false sense of superiority. On the day of the trial, Jamal's family was together as always. They walked into the courtroom holding each other's hands, showing the world that they would not be broken. When Jamal entered the hall in his wheelchair, people froze. His frail but proud presence was more powerful than any loud word. He was living proof that a person's spirit cannot be broken if there is support and love behind it. The judge listened carefully to the case, and when the verdict was pronounced, silence hung in the hall. Sergeant Burke was found guilty. He was stripped of all ranks and sent to custody. For him, it was the end. For Jamal and his family, it was the beginning of a new chapter. After the trial, they returned home and the guests gathered again in the courtyard where it all began. It was no longer a celebration, but the atmosphere was filled with warmth and unity. People smiled and hugged Jamal and his family, showing that they were not alone. "Do you know that you have changed the world?" Jamal's uncle asked, clapping him on the shoulder. Jamal shook his head, a slight smile lighting up his face. "I just want the world to be a little better for those who come after me," he said, "so that no one else feels what I felt." His words were like a silent prayer of hope. The family looked at him with pride, seeing not just a teenager in a wheelchair, but a man who with his spirit was able to stand up to evil and win. That evening, as the sun set, casting a soft golden light over the courtyard, Jamal looked at his family, his friends, and realized that his struggle had not been in vain. The power of unity, love, and a belief in justice had done what seemed impossible. They showed the world that evil can be defeated and that fortitude is always stronger than hate. Jamal's story was not only the story of his victory, but also a lesson for everyone who has ever faced injustice. It was a reminder that, despite all obstacles, we can always find the strength to fight. And though the scars will remain, they will be a reminder not of pain, but of resilience. Because fortitude, backed by love and unity, can conquer anything. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really need to hear your thoughts and your stories. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like so you don't miss out on new stories. Write the phrase, "Fortitude conquers evil," in the comments so we know you listened to this story to the end. We wish you a good day and justice in your life.